Imagine a world where the clash of swords and the roar of battle could decide the fate of entire nations. This was the reality of ancient Rome, and one of the pivotal moments in its history was the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. But to truly understand how Rome transformed from a powerful city-state to a sprawling empire, we need to start a bit earlier. Back in 197 BCE, the Battle of Cynoscephalae marked the end of the Second Macedonian War. This battle was significant because it showcased the might of the Roman legions against the famed Macedonian phalanx. By 146 BCE, Greece had become a province of Rome, demonstrating Rome's growing dominance in the Mediterranean. Cynoscephalae was important, but it wasn't the event that launched the Roman Empire as we know it. That transformation was influenced by the dramatic interplay of three powerful figures: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. Born Gaius Octavius Thurinus on September 23, 63 BCE, Octavian's early life was marked by tragedy and ambition. His father died young, so he was raised by his grandmother, Julia Minor, the sister of Julius Caesar. Despite his scholarly nature and lack of interest in military affairs, Octavian was smart and knew what his culture valued most: power and military success. In 46 BCE, seeking to prove himself, Octavian joined his great-uncle Julius Caesar on a campaign in Hispania. After surviving a perilous shipwreck and crossing hostile territories, he impressed Caesar with his determination and courage. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 15, 44 BCE, Octavian's life took a dramatic turn. Caesar had adopted him as his heir, making him Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Despite the danger, Octavian returned to Rome and allied with Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a powerful alliance aimed at avenging Caesar's death. They worked together to defeat Caesar's assassins, Cassius and Brutus, at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. After their victory, Lepidus was sidelined, Antony took control of the eastern territories, and Octavian returned to Rome. And Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, was Julius Caesar's third cousin once removed and one of Rome's most brilliant generals. Loved by his soldiers, Antony was Caesar's best friend. Despite a wild and rebellious youth, Antony dedicated himself to military training in his 20s, quickly showing his talent for leadership. He was tough, brave, and possessed a natural ability to command men. Antony was also infamous for his love of pleasure, wine, women, and gambling. Historian Anthony Everett notes, "He much enjoyed having sex with women, a weakness that won him considerable sympathy, and he was known for being generous, showering money on friends and soldiers when he had the funds." Antony fought alongside Caesar in Gaul, where their friendship deepened. Caesar, who abstained from drinking, tolerated Antony's indulgences in drinking, telling jokes, and matchmaking among the troops. After Caesar's assassination, Antony used his oratory skills, honed in Athens, to turn public opinion against the assassins. He then joined forces with Octavian and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, hunting down and defeating Caesar's murderers. After the victory at Philippi, Antony traveled to Tarsus in Cilicia. Here, he summoned Cleopatra VII of Egypt to answer charges of aiding Caesar's assassins. Cleopatra arrived in magnificent style on her royal barge, and the two soon became lovers. Antony found a perfect companion in Cleopatra, who matched his appetite for pleasure and adventure. Plutarch writes of Cleopatra's irresistible charm and her ability to enchant those around her. And Cleopatra VII, daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, began her rule of Egypt at around 18 years old, initially co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Unlike previous Ptolemaic monarchs, Cleopatra learned Egyptian and other languages, allowing her to communicate directly with foreign dignitaries. Strong-willed and difficult to control, she faced a coup by her advisors who placed her brother on the throne. Driven into exile, Cleopatra's fortunes changed when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing Pompey the Great. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, and she bore him a son, Caesarion. Their relationship caused a scandal in Rome, especially as Caesar was already married. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra fled with Caesarion back to Egypt. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE, their attraction was immediate and mutual. Despite their growing love affair, Antony's political career and life were at risk. Cleopatra, already a mother to Caesarion, would go on to have 3 more children with Antony: Alexander, Cleopatra's Selene II, and Ptolemy. While Antony indulged in his romance with Cleopatra, Octavian was busy managing the affairs of Rome, laying the groundwork for the eventual confrontation that would shape the future of the Roman Empire. After the death of Pompey the Great in 48 BCE, his son, Sextus Pompey, continued the fight against Caesar's forces. Sextus controlled Sicily and led a fleet of pirate ships, disrupting Roman trade. In 41 BCE, Octavian launched a campaign against Sextus. Antony, out of spite in his own ambitions, supported Sextus because he opposed Octavian, and also because Octavian had just quashed a rebellion led by Antony's younger brother. Eventually, Octavian and Antony agreed to a peace deal, which included Antony marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia. Without Antony's support, Sextus became an easier target for Octavian. With the help of his brilliant general, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, and Lepidus, Octavian defeated Sextus' fleet and killed him in 35 BCE. Lepidus tried to claim Sicily and Sextus' goods for himself, but this angered Octavian, who exiled him and sent him back to Africa. Meanwhile, Antony's attempts to elevate his status through military conquests were failing. His invasion of Parthia was a disaster, costing him 30,000 men, and he also failed to take Armenia. In contrast, Octavian was gaining prestige by dealing with piracy and securing Rome's northeastern frontiers through a series of impressive campaigns. By 33 BCE, the Second Triumvirate's legal tenure was ending. Antony informed the Senate he did not wish to be nominated again. He had already divorced Octavia and married Cleopatra. When Octavian protested, Antony wrote, "What has upset you? Because I go to bed with Cleopatra? But she is my wife, and I've been doing so for 9 years, not just recently. And anyway, is your wife your only pleasure? I expect that you will have managed, by the time you read this, to have hopped into bed with many different women. Does it really matter where or with what women you get your excitement?" Octavian found Antony's treatment of Octavia and his association with Cleopatra intolerable. The situation worsened when Antony declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, as Caesar's true heir, and bequeathed territories to his children with Cleopatra. Octavian realized that he needed to destroy Antony's popularity in Rome to defeat him. To undermine Antony's support, Octavian targeted Cleopatra through a propaganda campaign. He discovered that Antony's will was kept in the temple of the goddess Vesta, guarded by the Vestal Virgins. Octavian demanded access to the will, which the Vestal Virgins reluctantly allowed. Reading the will to the Senate in assembly, Octavian revealed that Antony planned to leave a considerable inheritance to Caesarion and his children with Cleopatra. Octavian accused Cleopatra of using her charms and spells to control Antony, just as she supposedly did with Caesar. This narrative turned the people and the Senate against Cleopatra, blaming her for Antony's actions. The Senate then declared war on Cleopatra, framing it as a mission to rescue Antony from her enchantment. And Antony would stay loyal to Cleopatra. Octavian pushed his propaganda forward, and he was right. Antony, with Cleopatra's support, mobilized his armies and took a position at Actium, Greece, on the Ionian Sea coast. Antony knew he couldn't march on Octavian in Italy with Cleopatra, as her reputation had been shattered by Octavian's smear campaign. However, he also couldn't leave her behind, as he needed her moral and financial support. He had to make Octavian come to him, and Octavian did just that. Much sooner than Antony expected, Octavian arrived with Agrippa and cut off Antony's supply lines from Egypt along the Peloponnese. Octavian then camped his land forces 5 miles north of Antony and Cleopatra, while Agrippa controlled the sea, preventing any escape. Antony knew his situation was dire. He had the war chests loaded onto Cleopatra's flagship and prepared his warships for a quick retreat if necessary. He agreed with Cleopatra that if the battle turned against them, they would break through Agrippa's fleet and escape back to Egypt. On September 2nd, 31st BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's ships met Agrippa's fleet outside the Gulf of Actium. Antony's ships, the massive Roman quinqueremes, were undermanned due to a malaria outbreak and were difficult to maneuver quickly. Octavian's ships were smaller, more agile Liburnian vessels equipped with ramming devices and fully manned with healthy crews. To make matters worse for Antony, one of his generals, Quintus Dellius, had defected to Octavian with Antony's battle plans. Hoping the wind would give him an advantage, Antony engaged Agrippa's fleet. But Agrippa's superior tactics, especially the use of the harpax, a hook that could secure enemy ships for boarding, quickly turned the tide. Antony's flagship was caught by a harpax, and the battle soon resembled a land battle with Agrippa's men boarding and attacking Antony's stalled ships. As the battle went poorly for Antony, his ships began to surrender or retreat. Following their plan, Cleopatra, with her 60 ships, raised sail and fled the battle. Antony abandoned his overwhelmed flagship, jumped to another ship, and followed Cleopatra with 40 of his own vessels, leaving behind 5,000 men and 300 ships to be destroyed by Octavian. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra tried to rally Antony to fight on. She suggested fleeing to Spain to capture the silver mines and start a new, powerful kingdom. But Antony, crushed by his defeat, had no interest in her plans and turned to drinking and neglecting his responsibilities. He only regained a semblance of his former self when Octavian arrived in Egypt in July 30th BCE. Antony led his forces against Octavian's advanced troops, briefly scattering them, but the next day most of his men defected, seeing no future with Antony. Believing Cleopatra was dead, Antony stabbed himself, asking to be brought to her. Cleopatra, still alive and secure in Alexandria, received Antony and he died in her arms. Octavian then took the city effortlessly and offered Cleopatra terms that included her being paraded as a captive in Rome. Cleopatra requested time to prepare herself, but instead, she killed herself to deny Octavian his prize. Octavian had Antony and Cleopatra buried together as they wished, and Caesarion was executed. Antony and Cleopatra's 3 children were taken to Rome and appeared in Octavian's triumphal procession. Octavian was celebrated as Rome's savior from Eastern domination, but he wisely presented himself as a humble servant of Rome. In 27 BCE, declaring the crisis over, he surrendered his power, which the grateful Senate quickly restored to him along with the title Augustus, and thus the Roman Empire was born.